The first thing I heard in the new apartment was a faint tapping, as if someone were knocking from behind the mirror before I even turned on the lights. A soft echo slipped through the frame, too deliberate to be plumbing and too patient to be random. When I finally looked up, the mirror showed a dim hallway I didn't recognize, a place far older and narrower than anything in the apartment. If the mirror only reflected what was here, then who lived in that hallway, and who kept brushing past its walls, like they were squeezing through an unseen crowd? The glass trembled as though a draft moved inside it, carrying distant footsteps that didn't match my breathing. A faint outline crossed the mirrored hallway and vanished before I could understand its shape. The surface cooled under my fingertips, colder than anything else in the room, and as I stepped back, the tapping returned, this time answering the rhythm of my heartbeat, as if it already knew I was listening. The next morning, the mirror was silent, yet it felt aware, as though it had memorized every sound I made overnight. The hallway inside it looked brighter now, washed in the pale light of somewhere far from this building. Nothing moved within it, but the air around the glass carried a strange tension, like the pause before someone speaks. I tried to ignore it while sorting through boxes, yet the mirror kept nudging at the edge of my vision, insisting on being seen. When I finally turned to face it, the reflected hallway had stretched longer than before, impossibly deep, as if the walls inside had breathed outward in the night. A soft scrape echoed from somewhere within that depth, too distant to place, too sharp to dismiss. The moment I leaned closer, a faint breeze drifted out toward me, carrying the scent of damp wood, and I wondered how far that corridor truly reached, or what waited for me at the end of it. By afternoon, the hallway inside the mirror felt occupied, not by one presence, but by several, each creating faint movements that vanished when I tried to focus. The long corridor swayed subtly, as though shaped by shifting weight, and every time I walked past, a soft rustle followed from its unseen corners. I forced myself to continue with daily tasks, yet the mirror tugged at me with an almost magnetic pull. It wasn't just showing a place, it was inviting attention, demanding it. The scrape I had heard earlier returned, now louder, paired with a dragging hush, like something being pulled across old floorboards. I stared into the depth, holding my breath, waiting for a form to appear. For a moment, everything froze, absolutely still, until one distant door in the reflection shifted a few inches, then slowly creaked open without anyone touching it. Evening arrived quickly, swallowing the apartment in a heaviness that felt borrowed from the mirror's world. Lamps barely lit the room, their glow fading before reaching the frame, as if the glass absorbed light faster than it should. Inside the reflection, the once empty corridor now showed doors slightly ajar on both sides, each hinting at rooms that never existed here. A soft thud echoed from within one of them, followed by a slow rustling that made the back of my neck tighten. As I watched, a shape leaned briefly into view, its outline trembling like static before dissolving back into nothing. I stepped closer, my breath clouding faintly even though the room was warm, and I sensed something waiting just beyond the mirror's reach. A sudden creak traveled down the corridor like a warning, and the doors inside began shifting on their hinges. Not long before midnight, the tapping returned, sharper and quicker, as if something inside had grown impatient. The mirror's corridor was now darker, its far end swallowed by an unnerving blackness that pulsed faintly, like a breath pushing against the edges. The doors within stood wide open, revealing only pitch-dark rooms that gave off no detail, no depth, only the sense of being watched from multiple angles. I stepped toward the mirror without realizing it, drawn by a quiet whispering that threaded itself beneath the tapping. My reflection moved normally, yet the corridor's shadows did not. They shifted independently, gathering near the open door at the far end. A final, chilling tremor ran through the glass, and a small object slid into view from the darkness inside. An old, tarnished key that stopped right at the threshold, as though placed there deliberately for me. The key sat untouched where the corridor's floor met the mirror's edge, and all night it pulled at my attention like a quiet pulse. By morning, the apartment felt unsettled, as if something had shifted during sleep, a faint hum lingering in the walls despite the stillness outside. The mirror's corridor was brighter now, lit by a pale glow that revealed new details: cracked tiles, wires hanging from the ceiling, and a long trail of dust disturbed by fresh movement. I tried to convince myself that the key was just an illusion, a trick of my tired mind, yet it hadn't vanished with the daylight. Instead, it lay clearer than before, positioned like a message meant only for me. When I stepped closer, the corridor seemed to exhale, releasing a slow gust that brushed my face and carried a hint of metal and rot. Something had placed that key there, and whatever it was seemed patient, waiting for me to decide whether to reach for it. I didn't touch the key, yet the corridor reacted as if I had. A soft rumble rolled through its walls, shaking loose dust that drifted toward the mirror like drifting ash. The apartment remained silent, but the world inside the reflection grew louder, restless. I watched the far end of the hallway, trying to understand how deep it truly stretched, and for the first time I noticed faint markings scratched along the baseboards. They ran in uneven streaks, curving like someone had been dragged past them. My stomach tightened as another rumble passed through the corridor, this time followed by a low, muffled thud from one of the open rooms. The key vibrated slightly against the floor, as if responding to the sound. Then something subtle shifted. The darkness in the far doorway receded a few inches, revealing a patch of floor that looked freshly cleaned, as though footsteps had recently wiped the dust away. The apartment felt smaller as the day dragged on, the mirror pulling more attention than anything else. The corridor looked longer with each passing hour, as if the distance inside were stretching to make room for something. The faint thuds had become steady now, arriving in slow, rhythmic intervals like a distant heartbeat. I tried covering the mirror with a blanket once, desperate for silence, but the fabric slid off within seconds, falling as if pushed from the inside. The corridor brightened in response, revealing fresh scuffs along the walls that hadn't been there earlier. A creeping dread settled in as I realized these marks lined up perfectly, with a path leading straight toward the threshold. Whatever moved in that world wasn't wandering anymore. It was approaching with purpose, and every thud felt closer than the one before. By evening, the thuds had stopped, replaced by a creeping silence more unsettling than any noise. The corridor, inside the mirror, looked abandoned again, yet not in the same way as before. The walls seemed damp, reflecting the light in uneven patches like fresh moisture had seeped through them. The key had shifted slightly, no longer centered but angled as though nudged by an unseen toe. I knelt down, trying to listen through the glass, and the silence pressed against my ears so heavily it almost rang. Then a faint sound leaked out. Soft, shaky breathing, not mine. It came from deep within the corridor, moving closer in slow, uneven bursts. Each inhale and exhale felt strained, as if the lungs making them didn't work right. The breathing paused suddenly, replaced by a faint click, and the door at the far end eased open another inch. Night fell with a dense stillness, and the apartment felt drained of warmth, as if the mirror had siphoned it away. The corridor was darker now, soaked in shadows that pulsed gently like unseen shapes moving behind them. A faint tapping began again, but this time it didn't come from the mirror's surface. It echoed from deep inside the reflection, as though something tapped the corridor wall with a hesitant rhythm. I leaned forward, drawn by the sound, and the shadows parted just enough to reveal a new detail. A thin line of light under a closed door halfway down the hall. It flickered weakly, blinking in uneven patterns like a signal. With each blink, the tapping grew sharper, almost impatient, and the key at the threshold trembled in place. The mirror's surface rippled once, softly, as if preparing for something to cross. The thin line of light beneath the mid-hall door pulsed through most of the night, but by morning it had faded into a dull haze, like whatever created it had grown tired. The corridor inside the mirror felt heavier now, its walls drooping as though weighed down by moisture or something unseen pressing from the other side. I noticed new smudges on the floor, long, sweeping marks that curved toward the threshold as if something had been dragged closer. Each time I looked away, I felt a subtle shift in the apartment's air, a faint pressure pushing against my back, urging me to turn around and check the mirror again. When I finally did, the door with the light beneath it was cracked open wider, showing a sliver of a dim room beyond. A slow shiver passed through the corridor, bending the hanging wires, and for the first time I sensed that whatever was inside no longer cared about hiding. By midday, the corridor felt louder without making any real sound. The air inside it shimmered faintly, as if heated by an unseen source, bending shapes that should have been still. The drag marks had thickened, deep grooves now etched into the dust, leading straight from the open room toward the threshold. I tried stepping away, but each movement made the corridor's shadows twitch in delayed response, like they were studying the space I left behind. A new detail emerged that made my stomach tighten. Faint fingerprints streaked across the tiles, smeared in uneven lengths, some large, some small, all pointing outward. Even without touching the mirror, I could feel a pulsing warmth radiating from it, like the breath of something standing just beyond view. Then a faint knock echoed from deep inside the corridor, slow and deliberate, followed by the tiniest shuffle of feet. As the afternoon dimmed, the corridor inside the mirror began revealing details I hadn't noticed before. The walls bore faint outlines, shapes resembling old picture frames, though whatever once hung there had left only pale rectangles behind. A soft rumble traveled beneath the floorboards of the reflected hall, rolling forward like distant steps made by something too heavy to move quietly. The grooves on the ground looked deeper now, almost freshly carved. I leaned in, compelled by an unease I couldn't name, and the air inside the corridor shifted again, this time with a slow inhale that pulled at the edges of my reflection. The faint breathing I'd heard before returned closer and steadier, no longer shaky but confident. Then, from one of the dark open rooms, a handprint pressed slowly into the dust, formed by fingers that weren't attached to any visible form. Evening settled with a suffocating weight, pressing the apartment into a silence that felt unnatural. The corridor's shadows deepened, swirling faintly like smoke gathering in corners. The door that led to the dim room had now opened wide, revealing nothing but a blank darkness thick enough to seem solid. The grooves in the dust no longer stopped halfway. They now ran all the way back to that room, disappearing into its pitch-black interior. I watched the mirror, my pulse thudding in my ears, and saw something new. Faint ripples along the corridor ceiling, as if something crawled just above the surface, moving slowly from one end to the other. The air grew cooler, brushing my skin with a sharp bite. The darkness inside the open room pulsed once, a single heavy throb, and the corridor lights flickered in response. By nightfall, the corridor felt alive with anticipation, every shadow poised as though waiting for a signal. The grooves in the dust had sharpened into clear tracks, tracing a direct path toward the mirror's edge. The mid-hall door with the flickering light was now completely open, leaving the thin glow to spill across the floor in a trembling line. I approached cautiously, unable to resist the pull. The breathing from inside the corridor steadied into a slow rhythm, matching the faint tremor in the apartment's floor. Then, without warning, the key at the threshold jerked violently to the side, scraping against the tile with a metallic screech. The corridor went still. From the depths of the open room, a pair of soft, uneven footsteps began moving forward, slowly, steadily, aimed straight toward the glass. The footsteps inside the corridor didn't fade with morning light. They grew clearer. Each step landed with a soft thud, dragging faintly as though the weight behind them resisted movement. The corridor itself looked more defined than ever, the dust disturbed in sweeping arcs that twisted toward the threshold like spiraling tracks. I stepped into the kitchen to break my gaze, but the apartment felt wrong, as if the mirror's world had seeped into the walls. When I returned, the corridor's lights were dimmer, flickering weakly as though reacting to my absence. The open room at the far end pulsed with a deeper darkness, and faint breathing rolled through the hall, steady and deliberate. A chill crept along the apartment floor, not from any draft but from the mirror itself. I watched in silence as something unseen dragged a fresh groove through the dust, carving a straight line toward me. By noon, the corridor felt only a breath away, its atmosphere pressing outward as if straining to reach the apartment. The grooves in the dust had multiplied, weaving into patterns too deliberate to be random. A faint hum filled the air, vibrating through the mirror's frame with a slow, rhythmic beat. When I leaned closer, I noticed new marks along the walls. Long, scraping arcs circling above head height, as though something tall had brushed against them. The open rooms on either side seemed darker, absorbing every flicker of light. I tried stepping back, but the corridor responded with a heavy shift, the dust lifting as though stirred by a sudden gust. Then, for the first time, I saw it, a shadow crossing the far end of the hall, moving with a slow, searching motion, its form too distorted to recognize. As the afternoon darkened, the mirror's world began to bleed into the apartment in subtle ways. The faint hum returned as a low vibration beneath the floorboards, growing stronger whenever I neared the glass. The corridor's lights flickered at random, revealing glimpses of movement in the open doorways, shifting shapes that withdrew whenever the light steadied. The grooves carved through the dust had deepened into trenches, tracing a clear path from the darkest room toward the threshold. I felt watched from every angle, as though something in the corridor studied me, adjusting its pace to match my breathing. Then came a soft shuffle, unmistakably close, followed by the brush of something sliding gently along the corridor wall. A single loose tile near the far end tilted upward, nudged by a slow, deliberate push from beneath. Evening settled in layers, each darker than the one before, and the air felt heavy enough to bend my posture. The mirror's corridor glowed faintly with uneven lighting, each bulb pulsing as though losing strength. The dark room at the end now felt deeper, its interior a void so complete it pulled nearby shadows into it. The trenches carved into the dust were no longer still. They quivered, as if something beneath the floor shifted restlessly. I leaned closer, trying to understand, and the corridor responded. A sudden gust of air blew through it, carrying a smell of damp earth and something metallic. Then the ceiling rippled again, more violently this time, bending downward like a soft membrane. A faint thump followed, shaking loose a cloud of dust that drifted toward the threshold in a slow, crawling wave. By night, the corridor no longer felt separate. It felt attached, as if an extension of the apartment. The pulsing void in the far room expanded, swallowing the last remnants of light and sending long shadows reaching down the hall. A muffled, dragging sound echoed from deep inside, slow and rhythmic, like something massive repositioning itself. The trenches in the dust widened, cracking into the tiles beneath, as though strained by immense pressure. I watched in frozen silence as the key, once resting near the threshold, lifted slightly, tugged by an unseen force that pulled it an inch closer to the mirror's interior. Then the dragging stopped. A moment of complete stillness settled across both worlds, and from the farthest point of the corridor, a low whisper traveled forward, soft but clear, as if the mirror itself finally spoke. The whisper that floated through the corridor didn't fade with morning. It lingered, repeating in soft loops that almost formed words. The apartment felt hollow, as if sound refused to settle anywhere except inside the mirror. The corridor looked sharper now, its walls straighter, its edges cleaner, as though something had tidied the space in preparation for what came next. The voided room at the far end pulsed in dim intervals, each throb sending a faint tremor through the reflected tiles. I noticed the key lying farther inside than before, pulled nearly a full foot past the threshold. Dust around it had been cleared in a distinct circle, too precise to be accidental, every time the corridor inhaled, because it truly felt like it breathed. The dust rippled toward that dark room. I stepped back instinctively, but the corridor seemed to lean forward, closing the distance by an inch I couldn't explain. By midday, the whispering had grown more confident, no longer hiding in echoes, but speaking in steady, quiet tones impossible to decipher. The corridor brightened in uneven patches, revealing fresh gouges along the floor where something heavy had scraped through with purpose. The open doorways that once felt empty now seemed occupied, shadows clustering inside them like figures waiting for instruction. I felt an uneasy pressure at the base of my skull, a nudge to draw closer, to listen more carefully. When I approached, the whispering softened into a slow cadence, almost beckoning. Then the lights in the corridor flickered violently, flashing enough to reveal a long shape slipping behind one of the door frames, thin and unsteady as it moved. The dust near the threshold stirred again, gathering in small spirals that rolled toward me, as though pushed by a gentle exhale. Afternoon stretched thin, and the apartment's air thickened with a cold weight that clung to every surface. The mirror's corridor shifted again, its walls tightening, as if pulled inward by invisible hands. The voided room at the far end emitted a faint rumble, its darkness churning like a storm behind closed curtains. The trenches carved across the floor now formed a clear trail, winding from the room straight to the threshold in a pattern that resembled steps, though far too wide to belong to any normal stride. I watched the corridor breathe in slow, heavy cycles. On each exhale, the doorways trembled, releasing thin wisps of dust as if stirred by unseen bodies inside them. Then came a sound I hadn't heard before, a soft, rhythmic tapping from the ceiling, traveling steadily toward the midpoint of the hall. Evening pulled long shadows across the apartment floor, blending seamlessly into the ones inside the mirror. The tapping on the corridor ceiling grew louder, now accompanied by a dragging scrape that moved in uneven intervals. The ceiling bulged downward in one section, bending under a slow, measured weight that crawled just above the panels. The lights flickered again, and in one brief flash I saw a silhouette pressed against the ceiling, distorted limbs stretched unnaturally wide before vanishing in the next blink. The trenches in the dust quivered in response, widening with soft cracks. A cold gust spilled from the mirror, brushing my ankles with a damp chill. Then, all at once, the ceiling went silent. A new sound replaced it, the unmistakable thump of something landing on the corridor floor. Night settled with a dense electric stillness, each second stretched thin by the anticipation that filled the apartment. The corridor no longer flickered. It glowed faintly, lit from a source deep within the voided room. The steps in the dust were clearer now, fresh impressions forming with slow, deliberate weight as something moved closer, one heavy footfall at a time. I could hear it, soft breaths, deeper than before, steady and patient. The shadows inside the doorways leaned forward, reaching subtly toward the center of the hall. The key, once pulled inside, now trembled violently, rattling against the tiles as though trapped between two forces. Then the corridor exhaled sharply, a single forceful gust that shook the mirror frame. At the far end, a tall, thin outline appeared in the darkness, motionless but unmistakably facing me. The silhouette remained at the far end of the corridor, long after dawn touched the apartment, refusing to fade with the light. Instead, the corridor brightened around it, outlining its shape in a way that made the distance between us feel dangerously thin. Dust on the floor shifted in tiny bursts, as though reacting to each slow inhale the figure took. The trenches cut across the tiles deepened again, forming sharp ridges that suggested constant pressure, like something had dragged itself forward during the night. I felt an urge to step closer, a pull as subtle as a whisper, yet strong enough to tighten my chest. When I blinked, the silhouette tilted its head slightly. Not enough to be clear movement, but enough to confirm awareness. The corridor lights flickered in response, casting long, trembling shadows that reached toward the threshold, like stretched fingers. By midday, the silhouette had moved. Not by walking, not by stepping, just by being farther down the hall than before, as though the distance between us had quietly shortened without either world acknowledging it. The air inside the corridor shimmered around its outline, bending slightly like heat above asphalt. The doorways on either side seemed to angle inward now, as if retreating from whatever stood in the center. I leaned closer, trying to make out finer details, but the corridor responded with a low vibration that buzzed deep in my ears. The dust shifted again, swirling into delicate spirals that drifted toward the figure and vanished at its feet. A soft tapping echoed from the walls, bouncing gently between door frames. And then, with slow certainty, the silhouette raised one arm, thin, deliberate, and pointed directly toward the threshold. As afternoon dimmed, the corridor's atmosphere grew sharper, almost metallic, with every breath I took pulling in a faint taste of rust. The silhouette still pointed toward the threshold, unmoving, but the corridor itself didn't share that stillness. The walls bowed inward with each flicker of light, shrinking the hallway by inches in a subtle but constant rhythm. The ceiling rippled again, the undulation now deeper and slower, hinting at something crawling just above it. I stepped backward, yet the corridor seemed to follow, pushing its brightness forward like a spotlight fixed on my hesitation. A new sound joined the shifting air. A gentle scraping from behind the open room nearest the silhouette, as though something inside repositioned itself. Then, without warning, the pointing arm lowered. The silhouette leaned forward, slightly, as if taking its first real step. Evening drew a thick veil over the apartment, but the mirror's brightness cut through it, casting pale reflections across the room. The silhouette had advanced again, now standing almost halfway down the corridor, its shape clearer, but still impossibly thin. Dust curled upward around it in small, trembling wisps. The trenches gouged into the floor seemed fresher, their broken edges sharp enough to catch the dim light. I couldn't look away, even as dread pressed heavy against my ribs. The corridor's breathing returned, slow, heavy, and full, as though inhaling the entire space. Each exhale fogged the mirror's surface from the inside, forming quick bursts of condensation that disappeared just as fast. One of the dark doorways beside the figure quivered, the frame bending slightly outward, like something inside pushed against it. As night settled, the mirror no longer felt like a boundary, it felt like an invitation. The silhouette stood only a few steps from the threshold now, tall enough that its head nearly brushed the rippling ceiling. Its limbs shook with tiny, controlled twitches, as though restrained by the corridor itself. The whispering returned in long, steady waves, each one carrying a low hum that vibrated through the apartment floor. The dust parted around the figure, forming a clean path that led directly to the mirror's edge. I felt the temperature drop sharply, a cold so deep it crawled across my spine. Then the silhouette did something it never had before. It crouched slightly, lowering itself until its elongated frame curled in a strange, deliberate posture. The corridor dimmed around it, and in the silence that followed, the figure began to inch forward, toward crossing. The silhouette held its crouched position through the early hours, frozen yet trembling with a tension that filled the apartment like static. When the first hint of morning light brushed the wall, the corridor brightened just enough to reveal the full outline of its limbs, stretched long and thin, as if made from shadow itself. The dust along the clean path shifted in tiny bursts, pulled forward by each shallow breath the figure took. I stood still, afraid to blink, worried that even the smallest movement might encourage it. Then faintly the corridor exhaled again, slow, deliberate, and heavy, sending a cold draft across the mirror's surface. The silhouette straightened a fraction, rising from its crouch with a slow, unsteady grace. The distance between us was now so small that I could feel the apartment air tightening around me, waiting for the moment it would choose to move. By midday, the corridor's atmosphere shifted again, warming slightly in a way that felt unnatural, like air heated from the inside out. The silhouette had risen fully and now stood angled toward the threshold, its posture rigid but purposeful. The dust at its feet rippled outward in slow waves, creating a pattern that looked eerily like a spreading pulse. The doorways behind it darkened until they resembled gaping wounds, swallowing all light that touched them. When I stepped closer, just one cautious inch, the silhouette tilted its head in a smooth arc that felt impossibly controlled. The corridor lights flickered twice, then held steady, illuminating the figure's elongated shape in stark clarity. A faint tapping began again, this time from directly beneath the floor of the reflected hall, echoing upward like a signal only the silhouette truly understood. Afternoon sank heavily across both worlds as the corridor's walls subtly expanded outward, creating a faint bow that made the space feel closer. The silhouette remained still, but the air around it shimmered with a faint vibration, as though the corridor struggled to contain its presence. The trenches in the tiles, once subtle, now cracked in thin, jagged lines that spread toward the mirror's edge, like branching veins. Every few seconds, a soft pulse of darkness traveled from the far end of the hall toward the figure, absorbed by its form, without altering its shape. I backed away, heart pounding. But the corridor answered with a deep inhale, pulling the light toward the silhouette in a sudden, unsettling dimming. Then, from somewhere behind the figure, a second shape flickered, fragile, incomplete, before dissolving into the nearest doorway. As evening seeped into the apartment, the corridor brightened with a pale, uneven glow that made every surface appear stretched and warped. The silhouette had edged even closer, now only a step or two from the threshold, its elongated frame trembling with small, tight movements. The dust tremored beneath it as if reacting to internal vibrations. A distant crashing sound broke through the corridor, echoing from the voided room at the far end. Something inside had shifted violently, sending a shockwave of air that rippled through the hall. The silhouette responded by straightening sharply, its limbs snapping into alignment with an unnatural precision. The corridor lights surged once, then dimmed, plunging the figure into a half-shadow that made its presence feel even more intrusive. The apartment temperature dropped again, as though preparing for something irreversible. Night arrived without a sound, thick and absolute, and the mirror's world shifted with it. The silhouette stepped to the threshold, not with a walk, but with a sudden silent correction of space, as if it had always been standing there and the corridor simply admitted the truth. The dust curled backward from its feet, swept aside by a cold force pushing outward. The tiles beneath it cracked in a thin radiating circle. I stood frozen, breath shallow, as the figure leaned forward until its elongated form brushed the inside of the glass with a slow, deliberate press. The mirror fogged instantly around the point of contact, a soft bloom of condensation shaped like a handprint without fingers. Then the corridor dimmed to near blackness, leaving only the silhouette's outline glowing faintly. But on my side of the glass, the room exhaled,